Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping softly into the quietly strange world of sleep-inducing history. The daunting challenges of the Middle Ages, a time full of curious customs, misunderstood beliefs, questionable decisions, and more than a few very uncomfortable beds. But before we begin, if you find comfort in these sleepy stories, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. In the comments, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is as you begin to drift off. It's always heartwarming to see the sleepy corners of the world coming together. Now, take a long, slow breath, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, or let the hum of the night keep you company, and with that, let's gently slip back through time, into the worn, weathered pages of the Middle Ages. The wind came early that year, brushing low over the grey hills, gentle at first, then stronger, whispering warnings through the thinning branches. The harvest moon, pale and heavy, hung over the countryside like a weary sentinel, casting a silver shroud over the slumbering earth. Beneath it, the fields lay quiet, not the restful quiet of bounty gathered, but the hollow silence of crops that had failed to rise. It was the year no one remembered wanting, a year without grace. The peasants called it the lean season, though there had been many lean seasons before. This one, they said, crept like fog, slow and endless, touching every corner of the land. And so the days dragged on, long and hushed, as families waited for the soil to offer something more than dust. Far from the stone towers of lords and bishops, in the low muddied dwellings of the common folk, time moved with the steady creak of wooden doors and the aching weight of empty storage bins. Grain sacks, once plump and resting in the corners of thatched huts, now lay like forgotten cloth. The bread ovens cooled, and with every passing night, the cold grew just a little bolder. In the dim half-light of dawn, villagers would trudge across fallow fields with tired tools in hand. Some poked at the dry earth, others stared into it as if waiting for a miracle to unfold beneath their feet. The earth, however, gave no reply, and so they returned, slow and silent, their boots heavy with muck, their breath forming soft clouds in the chill air. The livestock fared no better. Hens grew quiet, goats nibbled on fence posts. The cow's ribs showed through its coat like shadowed ridges on a winter hillside. In the barn, the straw smelled less of life and more of the long sleep that comes when the larder runs dry. Even the dogs, once noisy and full of chase, lay curled by the hearth, dreaming of meals that were now just memory. Life moved in whispers then. Words were spoken in low tones, not out of secrecy but exhaustion. Mothers hummed lullabies not to soothe their children into sleep, but to distract them from the gnawing ache in their bellies. Fathers sat by the fire, sharpening tools they no longer used. Grandparents told tales, long and winding, not to entertain, but to pass the slow time between one dusk and the next. And when it rained, which it often did, but never when wanted, the sky felt like a weight pressing down. The water was cold and constant, soaking into the walls, the straw, and the skin. It dripped from rooftops and noses alike. It blurred the line between home and field. The wet seeped into bones, into hope, into dreams that once held color and now seemed to fade into gray. Yet through it all, people endured. They did not thrive. No songs of joy rose from those hamlets, but neither did they vanish. They carried their weariness the way the old carry wool blankets, with quiet acceptance, with patience born of habit, and a knowledge that suffering is just another season. Some days there was soup made from roots. On other days, only water, but the fire still burned, dim though it was. The hearth still glowed, and sometimes, when the night was calm, you could hear the faint sound of someone humming, not a hymn, not a dirge, but something slow and soft that lived between memory and dream. The noble lords, in their cold keeps, rarely saw this suffering. Their ledgers still spoke of dues and rents. Their kitchens, though less generous, did not go bare. But even within those high stone walls, the chill of scarcity crept. Fires needed wood, and wood came from distant forests where laborers no longer chopped. Grain needed wagons, and wagons needed wheels and oxen, and the wheels broke, and the oxen perished. Slowly, even the great halls began to echo. Some monks in distant abbeys tried to explain the famine. They spoke of celestial alignments, divine wrath, or perhaps the sins of man growing too bold. They wrote by candlelight, scratching ink across stiff parchment, trying to give sense to suffering. But the ink froze, sometimes, and the candles burned out before the words were finished. And those who read them, if any did, found little comfort in the reasons. What comfort there was came in the form of ritual. A procession here, a prayer there, a gathering of villagers beneath a wide tree, their heads bowed as the priest read from worn Latin that few understood, but all accepted. Hope did not bloom like spring flowers in those moments, but it lingered, like breath on a cold morning, brief, faint. But enough children still laughed, now and then chasing each other between patches of withered stalks. Young couples still held hands in the dark, whispering dreams of summers to come, and old women still stitched, not because the garments were needed, many had given up on cloth, but because the act itself was calming. The rhythm, the repetition, the slow drawing of thread through thread. It was a kind of prayer, stitched in silence, even in the worst of it, when the rain would not stop, when the food ran out, when the fields turned to sludge, and the nights came too soon. Life refused to vanish. It dulled, it slowed, it bent beneath the weight of the season. But like the gnarled roots of the trees that stood leafless against the sky, it endured. And so the season passed, not with thunder or revelation, but with a slow exhale, one cold day giving way to a slightly warmer one. One bowl of water eventually replaced by one with a turnip inside. And then, slowly, very slowly, something green, faint, unsure, and still emerged from the earth. A whisper, once more. But this time, not of sorrow. This time, of return. In the gentle hush of morning, before the sun broke fully over the tree line, the farmer rose not with haste, but with the steady rhythm of one who had known the land his whole life. The wooden shutters creaked open, releasing the faint smell of wet earth and straw into the cramped hut. Another day, another stretch of toil in fields that asked much but gave little in return. There was no clock to chime, no rooster to call that had not already grown weary of crowing. Time, here, was kept by the movement of light across the floorboards and the sounds of animals stirring in their pens. A cough from the barn, the soft thud of hooves against wood. These were the bells of labor in the Middle Ages, the tools of the tiller were not elegant. They were crude, worn, and heavy. The plough, for instance, its being thick and rough, with splinters rested near the door. It had been fashioned by hand, repaired many times, and pulled not by horse, but by ox, or even a team of men when beasts were few. Its iron share, dulled by rock and time, was still sharp enough to break open the reluctant earth. Beside it, the harrow waited like a patient companion, its wooden frame jagged with iron teeth. After the plough tore open the land, the harrow followed, smoothing and pressing the clods, preparing them to receive seed. Each tool had its turn, like lines in a chant, repetitive, slow, and faithful. The farmer's hands, wrapped in rough cloth to ward off chill and splinter alike, reached for the yoke. The oxen stood silently, as they always did. Creatures of burden, yes, but more than that. They were partners in the long, slow dance of agriculture. Their eyes were dull but steady, and their bodies, though worn thin by years of strain, still carried the weight of the season's hopes. Feeding them came first. What little grain had been saved was divided carefully, some for planting, some for eating, and some precious and few for the animals that pulled the world forward. The farmer walked with his oxen into the field. Behind him, the sun began to stretch across the sky, casting golden lines across the furrows left from previous days. These furrows were shallow now, too often disturbed by rain or hardened by drought. Still, the work continued. The tilling of the land was more than labor. It was ritual, one step, one pull, one breath at a time. The rhythm was ancient, as if the soil itself demanded a certain pace, neither rushed nor delayed. With each row turned, the scent of damp clay rose into the air, rich and dark. It clung to boots, to sleeves, to the skin under fingernails. It was not unpleasant. It was simply present. The farmer's mind drifted with the rhythm, not far just enough to dull the aches and turn thoughts toward simpler things. A warm meal, a child's laughter, the possibility of a better yield next year. He spoke softly to the oxen, not expecting a response, only offering comfort in the familiar murmurs of the field. Good, now. Just a bit more. Slow now. His words melted into the wind, carried over the ridges. Tools needed mending. Always, the wooden handles cracked, the metal teeth bent. There was no blacksmith in every village, no easy trade for such services. So, the farmer learned to mend with twine, with leather, with nails pulled from old doors. Nothing was wasted. Every broken thing had a second life. The scythe, too, leaned against the wall of the barn, its blade curved like a crescent moon. It was not yet its season, but it waited in silence. When the crop sift they came were ready to fall, the scythe would sing again, a slow, swooping song, rhythmic and soft. But that would not be for many weeks, for now it rested. Livestock, beyond the oxen, played their quiet roles. Chickens clucked in the shadows, pecking for seed. Sheep, if there were any, grazed among the sparse grasses. Pigs rooted at the edges of the forest. Every creature had its task. Every creature, too, had to be fed. The barn was not large, nor was it clean. The floor was layered in straw, trodden by hooves and boots alike. It smelled of earth and animal warm, musky and raw. Here, children might sit to escape the cold, resting against a cow's side, feeling its steady breathing. The heartbeat of the farm when dusk came, as it always did too soon in those long months. The farmer walked the fields once more, slow and deliberate. Not to work now, but to watch, to see if any shoots had pushed through, to mark the tracks of rabbits, the flutter of birds, the state of the fences. The land did not speak with words, but it gave signs to those who knew how to read them in a corner of the field. Beneath an old tree whose bark had grown thick with moss, the plough was set down for the night. Not thrown, but placed as one might set a sleeping child into bed. It would be needed tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Inside the hut, the tools were leaned against the wall like resting sentries. The farmer sat by the fire, slowly removing his boots, each movement deliberate. His hands, cracked and lined, still smelled of soil and metal. He rubbed them slowly as the firelight danced on the walls. A bowl of thin stew was passed. A crust of bread, too hard to chew, was softened in the broth. No one spoke. There was no need. The silence was not sadness, was the peace that comes after long, steady labor. The kind of silence that settles not only in the room, but in the bones and outside. In the darkened field, the tools waited again, waiting to return to the soil, to turn it, to tame it, to serve it, not for glory, not for gold, but because the earth, in its own slow language, demanded it. The rain began without warning, not with the polite tapping of early showers, nor the gentle drizzle that paints the rooftops in beads of silver. No, this rain came as a curtain, thick, relentless, and heavy with intent. It fell from a sky, the color of tarnished iron, and it did not stop. For days and then weeks, the clouds remained like heavy wool pulled across the heavens. The sun, so long absent, became a memory. A rumor passed quietly from one soul to the next. And as the rain came down, it brought with it not just water, but a creeping sorrow that settled into the soil, into the walls, into the hearts of those who watched their worlds slowly drown. The fields, those sacred veins of medieval life, became puddled wastelands. Rows of wheat, barley, and rye, once hopeful with green promise, sagged and buckled beneath the weight of water. Their roots, choked and starved of breath, began to rot in silence. And with each morning, the once sturdy stalks grew thinner, darker, drooping like mourners in a procession of quiet loss. The mud was everywhere. It clung to boots, swallowed cartwheels, crept through the doorways of humble homes. Children no longer played at the edge of the field. They sat curled beside the hearth, listening to the rhythmic drip of water from the roof's edge, counting the sounds between lightning and thunder. Inside the barn, the animals suffered their own quiet misery. Hay grew damp and sour, a sponge. Instead of a feast, the goats coughed. The chickens nestled together for warmth, feathers dull and wet. A calf, born too early and too small, lay still in the straw, unmoving by morning. Life was tender here, and the rain too loud to hear its fading breath. The wooden beams of homes and granaries swelled with moisture. Thatched roofs, never meant to endure such endless downpour, began to leak. Drops fell steadily from rafters into bowls, into boots, onto sleeping mats. Mold crept in with the shadows. It grew on walls, on shoes, even on bread. There was no keeping dry, no sanctuary to be found, only dampness, thick, musty, and cloying, that settled into clothing, into blankets, into dreams. Crops stored before the rain began to spoil. Barrels of grain, once safe, turned sour with mildew. What little food had been set aside became suspect, bitter to the tongue, soft when it should have been crisp. Desperation gnawed where hunger had already made its home. The smell of rot became part of life, not jarring, but familiar. Villagers prayed, quietly at first, then more fervently. They gathered in the stone chapel on the hill, its roof leaking and benches warped. The priest, himself gaunt from reduced rations, led the mass. with steady hands. His voice echoed through the damp chamber, Latin syllables rising like mist, benedictions for dry skies, pleas for mercy. A candle guttered on the altar. Rituals resumed, some older than the church itself. A procession through the fields, barefoot and solemn, chanting ancient words passed down from pagan times. A circle of women dancing, slow, tired at the edge of the village well, scarves trailing like ribbons in the wind. A bucket of milk poured into the soil as an offering. It was all they could give. And still the rain came. Roads turned to rivers, and rivers to torrents. Bridges were swept away by swollen streams. Trade faltered, and with it the little hope that outside aid might arrive. Even the merchants stayed away now, their carts stuck axle-deep in sodden paths. Isolation settled over the land like a cold. Shoal the old spoke of years like this from long ago, whispered tales of famine and floods, of winters that followed too quickly after drowned summers. Stories of neighbors who left and never returned, stories of fields that took years to recover, if they ever did. The young listened, wide-eyed and silent, wondering if they too would be spoken of in hushed voices years hence. In every village, there was one or two who tried to hold fast to cheer. A woman who sang while scraping spoiled turnips, her tune light despite the task. A boy who splashed in the mud as if it were a game, though his laughter was thin. A man who carved small figurines by firelight, shaping animals from driftwood, and placing them on the shelf with quiet pride. These were not acts of joy, exactly, more like echoes of it. Reminders. The constant drum of rain began to work its way into minds. Dreams turned soggy and strange. Some spoke of hearing voices in the storm, others of faces in puddles. There were murmurs of curses, of old sins returned to collect their due. But most people didn't speak at all, not of fear, not of the future, just of the moment, and how best to get through it. As days passed, the water found every crack. It wore at foundations. It seeped into sacks and shoes. The sound of coughing became common. A woman fell ill, then another. The healer, old and wise, did what she could, brewing teas and burning herbs. But she too had fewer roots and barks to work with, and even fewer answers. But eventually, as all things must, the rain ceased. It did not stop with grandeur. No sudden sunburst, no rainbow, just a quieting, a lessening of the drip, a stillness. To the air, the sky did not brighten, but it lifted a little, as if taking a breath, and in the days that followed, the ground began to harden. Though the scars remained, deep rivulets etched across the landscape, flattened crops, and the stink of spoiled stores. The villagers emerged like creatures from burrows, blinking against the grey light. They surveyed the damage, not with panic, but with resignation. The work ahead would be hard. The fields would need tending, the homes mending, the livestock coaxed back to strength. But they had endured. Damp, hungry, and worn thin, but still present, and that, in the end, was all the land asked. Not triumph, not joy, but endurance. A quiet staying, a slow, steady presence through the storm. The fields had fallen silent after the rains, after the rotting, after the slow unraveling of hope beneath sodden skies. The world did not recover all at once. It never does. Healing, like hunger, is slow. And so the villagers waited, not with expectation, but with the same patient quiet that watches snow melt. Drop by reluctant drop, spring did not burst through the earth like a celebration. It crept, cautious and pale, uncertain of its welcome. The first signs were not flowers or birdsong. Those would come later. No, the first signs were smaller, quieter things. A softer breeze that no longer bit at the cheeks, the way the mud no longer sucked quite so deeply at the boots and the earth, loosening just enough to take the seed dot in homes still heavy with smoke and sleep. Seed sacks were opened with care. Not all had seed left. Not all had saved enough. What they had, they poured into calloused hands and counted, kernel by kernel. Each one a chance. Each one a thread in the long braid of hope. The planting began with ceremony, though none would call it that. A man might pause before the first furrow, head bowed slightly. A woman might murmur a forgotten rhyme as she scattered the grain. A child, watching nearby, might press a tiny hand to the soil, just to feel it breathe again. These gestures were not taught. They were remembered. The tools returned to the field, dull and scarred, but serviceable. Plows scraped, harrows dragged, hoes rose and fell in quiet repetition. It was not a swift or pretty process. The ground, though no longer drowning, was still bruised from the rains. Clods had hardened in places. Roots from last year's rot curled like old bones beneath the surface. But slowly, with care, the furrows lengthened. There was a rhythm to it. Not the rhythm of joy, but of necessity. Wake, work, rest, repeat. In that rhythm was comfort, the kind that does not chase away sorrow, but sits beside it. The kind that knows healing is not a burst of song, but a lullaby hummed on weary evenings. Hunger lingered, of course. It lingered in the eyes and in the bellies, in the thinness of limbs and the quiet way people moved. Children no longer cried for food. They had learned silence instead. The cries had been for when hunger was new. Now it was familiar, an old shadow walking beside them. It was spoken of only in glances and in the careful rationing of meals. Meals were strange now. Soups without meat, porridge without grain, broth made from bitter herbs. Yet every bowl was shared, and every scrap saved. Bread was baked with things never meant for baking. Ground bark, dried moss, a root of something half remembered from a grandmother's tale. It was hard, tasteless, and gritty, but it was something. And even in the smallest loaf, there was warmth. The monastery, just beyond the woods, sent wordless help. A basket of dried beans, left at the crossroads. A jar of oil, nestled in a hollowed stone. No names, no thanks, only the quiet understanding that some burdens must be carried together in silence. In the evenings, people gathered, not in great numbers, but in quiet clusters, around fires, under eaves, beside wells. They spoke in low tones, or sometimes not at all. A song might rise, faint and broken, from an old man with a wheeze in his throat. A girl might hum as she mended her only tunic. These sounds did not fill the night, they simply lived within it, like stars barely visible in a foggy sky. And slowly the fields responded. The first green shoots were fragile, so thin they bent in the breeze, so pale they nearly blended into the soil. But they rose, hesitant and slender, like tiny hands reaching toward light. When the first sprout was spotted, no cheer erupted. Just a few quiet nods, a slow smile. The kind of joy too tired to dance, but grateful enough to kneel. The days warmed. Bees returned, their hum a balm to the still air. Birds chirped from hedgerows. The sheep grew bolder, venturing farther from the pens. Life began to thread itself back into the fabric of the village, not with bright colors, but with soft stitches. Still, nothing was guaranteed. A single frost could undo the fragile growth. A swarm could devour what little had risen. A sickness could sweep through man or beast. And so, the villagers kept to their patience. They did not speak of bounty. They did not dream aloud. They simply watched, waited, and worked, hands in soil, eyes on sky. The children learned these lessons, too. They learned how to weed a row without disturbing the roots, how to check the wind before scattering seed, how to listen to the bees, the birds, the creak of the branches. These lessons were not taught in schoolhouses or scribed. They were passed in gesture, in repetition, in the slow inheritance of survival. In time, the fields grew greener. More shoots, more stems, some even strong enough to sway, softly, in the warm air. The crops would not be abundant. No feast would come, but they would be enough. Enough to fill the bins a little. Enough to bake bread without bark. Enough to see another season. And so, in that quiet between devastation and recovery, the people lived, not loudly, not boldly, but faithfully. Their hope was not a shout, it was a whisper, a breath drawn deep, a seed pressed into warm soil, and in that they endured. The castle stood upon the hill like a great sleeping beast, still, silent, and unmoved by time. Its towers pierced the pale sky, their stone edges softened by moss and memory. Beneath its weight, the world turned slowly. Seasons came and went, but the castle remained, watching over the village below with eyes of arrow slits and a mouth of rusted gate chains. Inside those thick stone walls, life moved not with ease, but with order. The air was always cool, touched by a lingering chill that no hearthfire ever quite erased. Even in summer, one might feel the cold rising up through the flagstones, curling softly around the ankles like an unseen cat. It was the sort of cold that settled not just in bone, but in habit. People dressed in layers not just for warmth, but because it felt wrong not to, at dawn. The great hall stirred, not in bursts of activity, but with the quiet creaks of waking life. A scullion swept the long floor, her broom whispering across the stone. Somewhere deeper within the castle, a cook stoked the kitchen hearth, coaxing sleepy flames from the night's ashes. The scent of smoke drifted upward through winding staircases and arched doorways, curling into every corner of the keep. The lord of the castle, wrapped in wool and weary with the weight of land and law, rose with the light. His chamber, high in the tower, offered little comfort beyond its view. The bed, while grand in frame, was hard. The linens coarse. The tapestries on the walls swayed gently in the breeze that slipped through the narrow windows. He dressed without ceremony, as he had each morning for decades. There was no rush. Rulership was not loud. It was slow, measured, and dull in its repetition. In the lower levels, the servants moved like shadows. They knew the halls better than the nobility did. They walked in silence, their feet memorizing the cold slabs beneath them. They spoke only when necessary. A nod, a glance, a whispered reminder to refill the oil lamps, to mend the curtain torn by last week's wind. Time was kept, not by bells, but by tasks. The castle itself marked the hours, the way sunlight crossed the dining hall, the creak of the drawbridge, the bellows of the smithy echoing faintly from the yard. Meals were quiet affairs. In the Lord's hall, long tables sat beneath high beams, carved and aged. Plates of pewter and cups of wood were set with care, though they bore more barley and broth than feast and finery. The nobility chewed slowly, spoke softly, and often stared off, not out of rudeness, but because the stone walls offered little to look at, and minds were always elsewhere. Life within the castle was not luxurious. It was structured, rigid, worn smooth by centuries of the same footsteps. The walls, though strong, allowed little sunlight. Candles had to be lit even on summer afternoons, their glow flickering across faded stone. Tapestries and rush mats softened the echoes, but the castle never let one forget where they stood in the arms of stone, in the shadow of permanence. Children played in the courtyards, their laughter quieted by the walls. They chased each other through herb gardens and past laundry lines, tossing pebbles and petals alike. Their games were simple, a stick as a sword, a ribbon as a prize. Their echoes rang faintly up the towers, a reminder that even stone could host life. Guards stood at post, unmoving for long hours. Their armor creaked when they shifted. Their eyes, often tired, scanned the horizon more out of habit than fear. The castle had seen no war in years, perhaps decades, but tradition held firm. The drawbridge still rose at dusk. The gate still groaned closed. In the chapel, a single candle burned at all hours. The priest moved slowly, his robes trailing along the flagstones like mist. He spoke softly to God, and softer still to the people. His sermons were brief, his presence steady. Even those who did not listen found comfort in the sound of his voice, echoing in the vaulted chamber like a lullaby of faith. Winters in the castle were long. Fires flickered in the hearths, though their warmth never quite reached the corners of the rooms. People huddled beneath layers of wool and fur. Bread was baked dense to last longer. The snow piled high against the outer walls, muffling the world. On such nights, the castle felt both protective and oppressive, a refuge and a prison made of stone. Despite the cold, there was a strange peace to it. The castle offered constancy. It offered rules, rhythms, and rituals, from the sweeping of ash to the tolling of iron bells. Every task had a place, every hand a purpose. There were few surprises, and in that there was calm. At night, the torches were doused, one by one. The castle dimmed slowly, like the closing of tired eyes. In the kitchens, pots cooled. In the chapel, the last prayer was whispered. The guards paced their slow watch, and behind thick wooden doors, people laid down in silence, listening to the wind hum through the arrow slits and the gentle creak of ancient timbers above. The castle did not sleep. Not fully, it breathed slowly. It waited without hurry. It endured, and within its belly, life went on, not with song or celebration, but with the quiet persistence of those who had learned to live inside stone. Below the great castle, that unmoving monument of stone, the village lay curled like a child beneath its mother's cloak. From above, its cottages appeared as soft humps upon the land, their thatched roofs patched with straw and moss, their walls leaning slightly from years of wind and rain. The paths between them were narrow and worn, more like memory than design, shaped by centuries of footsteps rather than any guiding hand. Morning in the village did not come with bells or fanfare. It came quietly, like the lifting of a blanket. A dog barked once, lazily. Smoke drifted from low chimneys, curling into the pale sky. Somewhere, a woman's voice could be heard humming, low and steady, as she stirred the hearth. It was not a song to be performed. It was a sound to fill the silence. The homes themselves were simple and small. Walls made of wattle and daub, reinforced with timber beams. kept the wind at bay as best they could. Inside, the rooms were dim, lit by whatever sunlight could slip through the oiled parchment of windows or the cracks in the shutters. A single fire, kept burning almost always, served as light, warmth, and stove. Its smoke rose through a hole in the roof or an open door when the air grew too thick. Furnishings were sparse. A low table, a few stools, straw mattresses layered with rough linen, wooden chests for storage, hooks in the beams to hang dried herbs or what little clothing a family owned, and in the corners, bundles of kindling and baskets of roots, quietly waiting their turn. Most families shared one room. Parents, children, even the occasional aging grandparent, all tucked into the same space, each claiming a corner. There was little privacy, but little need for it. Life was shared. Food, space, labor, breath, all intertwined. One person's sleep was another's lullaby. One's cough a cue for tea to be warmed over the fire. Work began as soon as light touched the soil. Men took to the fields or the woods. Women tended to animals, fetched water from the stream, kneaded dough made with flour stretched far beyond comfort. Children helped, always. A boy chasing stubborn hens back into their coop. A girl grinding grain between stones, her arms aching but patient. Even the very young had tasks, gathering eggs, snapping kindling, carrying baskets. It was not burden, but belonging. Villagers greeted one another not with exuberance, but with nods, quiet smiles, and the occasional, a fair morning. Then, words were soft, eyes were knowing. Everyone knew who had lost a goat, whose roof had sprung a leak, whose bread had failed to rise. News traveled not by gossip, but through presence. A late return from the woods, a missing seat by the hearth at dusk. Life here was seen before it was spoken. The village square, though not square in shape, was a place of slow gatherings. A bench beneath an old tree, a well with a bucket and rope that creaked in familiar rhythm, a small shrine to a saint, its stone face worn smooth by generations of fingertips. Children played nearby when chores allowed, their laughter softened by the hush of the earth. Market days came now and then, not with fanfare, but with quiet excitement. A peddler's cart arrived, its wheels muddy and one lantern swinging. He laid out wares on a cloth, iron nails, colored thread, salt, dried apples, a comb of carved bone. People came slowly, examining each item as though it were a rare gem. Counting coins carefully, barter was common. A wedge of cheese for a pair of new laces, a bundle of onions for a scrap of linen. Evenings in the village were the most peaceful of all. As the sky dimmed, villagers returned to their homes in pairs or small groups, boots thudding softly on the packed dirt. Doors closed with gentle squeaks. Fires were stoked once more. Shadows lengthened across the walls, flickering with the dance of flame. Supper was rarely extravagant, a stew of lentils, a crust of bread, perhaps a slice of preserved meat, if luck or trade had been kind. Yet it was enough. Enough to gather around. Enough to quiet the stomach and warm the spirit. It was often shared from a single pot, ladled carefully into wooden bowls. Children ate first, followed by the elders, then the rest. It was not spoken, only known after the meal. Stories might be told, slowly, softly, not dramatic tales, but simple ones, of wolves in winter, of the lost path through the woods, of the man who saw a light in the sky and followed it to a grove where the apples never rotted. These were not tales to stir the mind, but to settle it. Stories passed from mouth to mouth like warm bread, soothing and steady. When it came time for sleep, the fire was banked, and the last candle snuffed with a whisper. The air grew cool, but not uncomfortable. People curled into beds of straw, wrapped in wool blankets worn soft with time. Outside, an owl might call, a breeze might stir the thatch. But inside the huts, sleep came slowly and surely, like a mist rolling in over quiet land. And always, beyond the village and above it, the castle watched, silent, unchanged. But down here, in these humble huts and earthen yards, life unfolded, one quiet moment at a time, not grand, not loud, but real and enduring. In the medieval village, life did not begin with an alarm or a rooster's cry, but with the slow shifting of shadows across the packed earth floor. Morning light seeped in through the cracks in the shutters, gentle and grey. The fire, banked low through the night, gave off only the faintest warmth. Still, it glowed softly, as if waking before the people did. A yawn from the eldest daughter, the stretching of legs beneath woolen blankets, the faint rustle of straw. Slowly, the family stirred, not with noise, but with purpose. A new day had come, as all days did, quietly and without drama. The father rose first, as was his way. His joints popped like small branches snapping underfoot, and he took a long breath before pushing open the wooden door. The morning air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of dew, soil, and the faint tang of distant smoke. Clouds hung low on the horizon, unmoving. Another working day. In every household, similar rituals played out, not rushed, but practiced. A mother kneaded dough in a rhythm passed from her own mother. A boy fetched water from the stream, careful not to spill as he walked with bare feet over uneven stone. A girl swept ashes from the hearth and fed the fire with kindling. Each role was known, each task a thread in the quiet tapestry of the village. The day's labor began not with a single command, but with shared understanding. In the fields, men stooped to tend the soil. Some tilled with simple hoes. Others mended low stone fences that separated one patch of land from another. Their tools were worn, their hands rough, but their movements smooth, practiced, almost graceful. The work was not rushed. It could not be. The earth did not yield to speed. It responded to rhythm, to care, to patience. In the gardens closer to home, women bent over rows of leeks and cabbages, their skirts dusted with soil, their hands brushing aside weeds. Chickens clucked around their ankles. From a distance came the low bleat of goats and the occasional bray of a stubborn mule. Even the animals had their roles, not pets, not companions, but workers, each relied upon for milk, eggs, strength. Children, when not yet burdened by full tasks, found their own place in the rhythm. They gathered sticks for the fire. They fetched herbs for cooking or mending. They learned the motions, how to spin flax, how to mend a net, how to patch a roof, not through instruction, but through watching. Every gesture was a lesson, every task a rehearsal for the years ahead. The village's pace was slow but full. There was always something to be done. Bread to bake, fences to mend, wool to card, water to boil, a roof to thatch, a tunic to patch. Yet no one ran and no one rushed. Time, in the Middle Ages, was not a thing to beat. It was a thing to live beside, step by step, breath by breath. Midday brought a pause. Not a feast, but a moment. Workers returned home or gathered in twos and threes near the well, sitting on stumps or stone walls, chewing slowly on bread and cheese, perhaps a sliver of smoked meat if it was a lucky day. Water was passed from a shared jug. Words were few, and when they came, they were gentle. Observations about the weather, a brief memory, a soft chuckle, and then work resumed. The afternoon passed in the soft hush of labor. A smith, bent at his forge, hammered out tools with steady strikes. A weaver worked the loom, the rhythmic clack echoing through her cottage. A shepherd guided his flock to shaded pasture, leaning on a crooked staff, his dog padding at his heels. Each person moved through their duty like a verse in an old, familiar song. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the light turned gold and slow. Shadows stretched across the fields. The village exhaled. Ivying did not rush in. It seeped like warmth into cloth. People returned home, their faces marked with dust, their bodies weary but not hurried. Children were called in from play. Water was poured into basins for washing. Bread, now baked and cooled, was sliced with care. A pot of soup or stew simmered over the fire, thick with whatever had been gathered, roots, herbs, scraps of meat, if fortune smiled. Supper was a time of quiet togetherness. Families sat close. Food was not abundant, but it was shared without complaint. Conversation was soft, perhaps a prayer murmured together, a blessing for health, for the crops, for the coming day. There was no music beyond the crackling of the fire, no entertainment but the company of one another. After the meal, tasks slowed. Wool was spun, a shirt was mended by firelight. A child, half asleep, leaned against her mother's shoulder. A man sharpened a scythe, the wet stone whispering across the blade like sand on shore. The work continued, but gently, the day's labor easing into evening stillness. And then, one by one, candles were pinched out. Fire was banked. Doors were shut with a soft thud. Beds of straw were fluffed and laid upon. Bodies curled beneath blankets of woven wool. The sounds of sleep began. Steady breathing, the occasional cough, the shifting of limbs. Outside, the village faded into darkness. The wind rustled thatched roofs. An owl called once, then again. Far above, the stars began to appear, slowly, cautiously, as if peering down through the velvet sky to watch the world below drift into dreams. The day had passed, not in excitement, but in purpose, not in noise, but in need. It was a day like many before it, and many after it, a day of quiet toil, a day stitched into the fabric of survival, strong and simple, and in that simplicity, in the slowness, in the sameness, there was peace. Though the rhythms of medieval life were shaped by labor, there were also pauses, not sharp interruptions, but soft breaths within the long song of the seasons. These were the times when hands stilled and voices lifted, when tables held more than barley and broth, and when even the castle's cold stones seemed to warm slightly. These were the festivals, the feasts, the quiet celebrations woven through the hardships, steady and slow. They came not from calendars as we know them, but from the earth, the church, and the stars. The people did not consult paper, but sky and soil. The blooming of the first snowdrops, the fattening of sheep, the ripeness of berries, these were signs. They signaled that time had moved, and with it came a holy day, a seasonal rite, or a simple moment to rest. The year began with cold breath and fasting. Winter, long and lean, led into Lent, a season of restraint. No meat, no merriment. But even in this solemn time, the village found its rhythm. A pot of beans shared between neighbors. A hymn hummed low by the hearth. And when Easter arrived, soft and early some years, late and bursting in others, it brought with it boiled eggs, fresh bread, and a rare sweetness that felt like sunlight on the tongue. Spring festivals were gentle. May Day, when it came, was not a riot of color, but a soft unfolding, ribbons tied to a tree, flowers braided into hair, a boy's shy dance, a girl's soft laughter. The villagers did not shout, they smiled, they did not leap, they swayed. Even celebration held the slow patience of a people tied to earth and season. Summer was fuller, the days stretched longer, and so did the feasts. After planting was done and before the harvest began, there was a lull. It was here that the midsummer feast arrived. Tables were drawn into the open, laden with bread, cheese, whatever fruit had ripened. Someone always played a fiddle, its notes drifting like pollen. A jug of ale passed from hand to hand. The music was never fast. The songs were old, slow ballads that told of fields and lovers and gentle ghosts that watched from tree branches. At harvest, the festival was not held before the work, but after. Fields first, celebration later. The wheat must be gathered, the grain threshed, the sheaves stored safely in barn and bin. Only then did the village draw together in honest relief. A table under a stretched canvas, a pig roasted, apples set in rows, a pie, rare and small, carved into narrow slices so all might taste. And always, between bites and sips, came stories. They were told not with theatrics, but with quiet voices and long pauses. A tale of how the rain nearly ruined the barley crop, but the priest's prayer turned the clouds. A memory of a past harvest, when an ox broke free and danced through the field. Laughter, slow and shared, rose like steam from tea. Even in the castle, feasts had their place, though more structured. They echoed the same themes. The great hall, usually dark, was lit with long tables bore trenchers of meat, stewed fruits, crusty bread spread with soft cheese. The Lord dined at the high table, but his people below shared in the plenty. Musicians stood in the corners, not to stir dancing, but to accompany the murmured conversations, the clinking of cups, the low hum of satisfaction. Autumn festivals leaned toward reflection. All Hallows Eve approached on soft feet, a candle placed in a turnip, a loaf of soul bread given to a passing stranger. Stories of the dead told gently, not to frighten, but to remember. The nights grew longer, and people gathered closer. There was warmth in nearness, in shared light, in voices whispering tales beside fading fires. Winter brought the most anticipated celebration, Christmastid. It was not loud, nor filled with gifts, but it was full of song carols sung by firelight, slow and sweet, full of food, spiced cakes, rich stews, dried fruits plumped in wine, full of ritual, the lighting of a candle, the placing of a branch above the door, and full of rest. For once the tools were set down, the fields forgotten, the beasts blanketed. There was time to sit, to sip, to sigh. 12 days passed in a hush, as snow softened the world and the sky held stars a little closer. Children lay on their backs in straw lofts, listening to stories of St. Nicholas, of miracles, of a single night so still the animals spoke. Whether true or not, the stories were never questioned. They were meant to soothe, not inform. And always, in every season, feast or fast, celebration or sorrow, the pattern returned. Work followed rest. Planting followed frost. A fast followed a feast, and so the village breathed. It did not gasp. It did not cry out. It breathed deeply and rhythmically, like a slumbering giant nestled beneath the hill. The festivals gave shape to this breath, like soft punctuation in the sentence of survival, a comma, a pause, a moment to say, we are here. We are still, even if the bread was thin, even if the winter was long, even if the sky gave no answer. They gathered, they sang, they shared what little they had, and then, slowly, quietly, they carried on. There was no warning, not at first, just a hush, a shift in the wind, a tension that settled over the village like fog creeping through an open door. Birds grew quiet, dogs barked less, even the bells of the chapel rang more slowly, their echo dragging like weary footsteps across stone. Then came the cough. It began in one home, a low sound muffled by a blanket. A man curled on a straw mattress, sweating in his sleep. The next morning, his wife did not come to the well. 2 days later, the door to their cottage remained closed. No smoke rose from the chimney. Children whispered and pointed. The healer came and left again in silence. Soon, the cough was everywhere. It wasn't loud. It didn't roar like a storm. It whispered, through alleyways and market stalls, behind shutters and under blankets. A sound like dry leaves rustling, followed by fever, and swellings, dark and terrible, beneath arms, along necks, at the groin, painful to touch, burning hot. The villagers did not know its name. They called it simply the breath, for it seemed to move with air itself, unseen, unstoppable. Later, others would call it the Black Death. The castle tried to remain apart. Gates closed. Guards turned away traders, even those bearing salt and grain. But stone does not stop air, nor does it halt fear. The illness found its way in, perhaps through a stable boy, or a cask of wine, or a pigeon roosting beneath the eaves. Inside the great hall, the hearth continued to burn. Food was still served, yet eyes darted more often. Conversations shortened. A single cough could cause the room to still. The servants were the first to fall ill, then a scribe, then a cousin of the Lord, each death closer than the last. Quiet, quick, final dot in the village. Life unraveled. Carts rolled through the streets, no longer bearing grain or firewood, but the shrouded dead. There were not enough hands to dig graves. At first, each was laid, to rest with a prayer, a candle, a tear. But in time, there were too many. The candles ran out. The prayers became murmurs. The tears dry. People stopped gathering. Markets closed. Doors remained shut. Families isolated, not just from neighbors, but from one another. A daughter might sleep in the loft while her mother died below. A brother might slip away during the night, leaving behind silence and fear. It was not cruelty. It was despair, heavy, suffocating. The healer worked without rest. Her hands raw from washing in lye and herbs. Her eyes red from smoke and loss. She burned rosemary in each room she entered, hoping the scent might cleanse the air. She boiled nettles, brewed bark teas, wrapped swellings with linen soaked in vinegar. Sometimes the patient survived. More often, they did not. She never stopped trying. The chapel bell tolled too many times, and then stopped altogether. The priest fell ill. A young boy found him kneeling before the altar, unmoving. The candles had long gone out. From that day, the chapel door remained open, wind passing freely over its stone floor. People came alone, or not at all, and yet, even as the breath spread and the sky remained grey, some things persisted. A mother still combed her daughter's hair gently, though her own hands trembled. A man still fed the chickens, knowing no one might eat their eggs. A child whispered a story to her brother as he lay too weak to respond. These small kindnesses, soft as thread, strong as twine, stitched together a kind of quiet resistance. Eventually, the illness slowed, not because of a cure or understanding, but because it had taken what it could. It moved on like a shadow, at dusk, fading with no apology. The village was quieter now, fewer voices, fewer footprints in the dirt. But the well still gave water, the fields still held seed, the sun still rose, as if unaware of the sorrow below. People emerged slowly, blinking against the pale light. Doors opened cautiously, paths were swept, graves were tended. No one spoke of recovery. They spoke only of what remained. A neighbor, a lamb, a song half remembered. The castle gates creaked open once more. A new priest arrived, walking with measured steps. His sermon was brief, his eyes kind. He did not speak of punishment or wrath. He spoke of soil and breath and endurance, of how even the darkest winter ends, and the earth does not forget how to bloom. And so, the village did not rebuild in grand fashion. It repaired, one stone placed, one beam mended, one fire lit. The rhythms returned, slowly, haltingly. A market with only 3 stalls, a meal shared by 2 families, a wedding held under a tree with a single ribbon tied to the branch. But every cough still brought silence, every fever a chill. The memory of the breath remained, and yet so did the people, bent but not broken, changed but not erased. They walked the same paths, tilled the same fields, sang the same soft songs, slower now and with fewer voices, but still. They sang because that too was survival. Fire was always near, not in a raging way, not like the dragons of ancient tales, but in quieter forms. A spark in a hearth, a torch in a stable, a lantern hung too close to cloth. It lived in the walls and the ceilings, in the straw thatch and the timber beams, in a time of dry winds and wooden homes. Fire was both a friend and a ghost, warming, flickering, and waiting. The villagers knew this, of course. Every child learned how to tend a flame, not to feed it too quickly, never to leave it unwatched, always to have water nearby. Yet even with care, fire had its moods, and when it chose to rise beyond control, it did so swiftly, like breath, drawn too sharply, like a scream that could not be silenced. It might begin in a single home, a cooking pot left too long, or a candle tipped by a curious hand. The first sign, a strange light through the shutters. The next, smoke, thin and grey at first, then thick and choking. Then came the shouts, not panicked, but firm. Bucket, water. Now, the whole village would rise, not in chaos, but in practice. Buckets passed from hand to hand, well to flame again. Faces wet with sweat and smoke. Children pulled back, animals herded away. Everyone played a role, but sometimes it was not enough. A roof might fall inward with a groan. Sparks might leap across the narrow lane. A single flame could take a row of cottages, one after another, until all that remained were black beams and glowing coals, no louder than a whisper, no softer than sorrow. The aftermath was always silent. People stood and watched, not in shock, but in stillness. They did not weep right away. They did not shout. They simply looked at the ashes, at the things that once held stories. A stool, a cradle, a chest of clothes. All gone, reduced to ember and dust. And yet, the very next morning, someone would pick up a broom. Someone would stack the unburnt stones. Someone would offer bread and a corner of their home. Life, even after fire, found a way to breathe again. But fire was only one of many trials. Famine, too, crept on quiet feet. It did not come with fanfare. No sudden arrival, no clear enemy. It came with grey skies and damp soil, with seed that refused to sprout, with rains that washed away the promise of harvest, or with a sun that scorched too long, cracking the land, baking the fields into silence. At first, people rationed. Smaller portions, thinner soups, more water, less meat. Then they stretched their stores, boiling bones again, grinding bark into flour, finding bitter roots and drying nettles for tea. Still, the bins emptied. Mothers fed children before themselves. Fathers tightened belts rather than complain. The elderly often chose the quietest corner, needing less, asking for nothing. The village grew quieter. Play stopped. Laughter thinned. Eyes became watchful. Every rabbit seen near the hedgerow was followed carefully. Every squirrel, every bird. Even worms were dug and tasted by some dot in the castle. Things were no easier. The granary was locked. Not out of greed, but necessity. The Lord had to weigh each sack, each loaf. There were soldiers to feed, children in the keep, tenants in the village. Rations were drawn carefully, with parchment notes and sealed orders. It was not generosity that governed distribution. It was grim arithmetic, dot and famine, like fire, left its mark, not just on the ribs of the hungry, but in the way people looked at the land afterward, with suspicion, with longing, with a kind of love that had been hurt. Still, when the rain returned, or when the frost finally lifted, the people planted again, with fewer seeds, with thinner hands, but with hope, slow and stubborn. Destruction came not only from nature. Sometimes it walked on two legs, carried swords, and rode horses. Raiders from distant lands, war bands from rival lords, or lawless men with nothing to lose. The village, with its humble fences and thatched roofs, had little defense. There were no standing armies, only watchmen and prayers. When rumors of danger spread, the village prepared in the only ways it could. Goods were hidden, tools buried in fields, food stored in forest hollows. Children were kept close. The priest offered blessings, and always a lookout stood by the high road, watching the horizon for dust and motion. Sometimes the danger passed, sometimes not. When it arrived, it came swiftly, shouting hooves, torches, a clang of steel on doorposts. Some villagers ran to the woods, clutching children, bread, a single blanket. Others stayed, protecting what they could. The attackers rarely lingered. They came for food, animals, tools, and then were gone. But they left behind broken doors, trampled gardens, and eyes that no longer trusted the quiet. And yet, even then, the next day came. People returned. They gathered what was left, a broom, a chicken that had wandered back, a pot left untouched. And they began again. Not because they had to, but because there was no other way. Through fire, through famine, through fear, the medieval people endured. They did not call it bravery. They did not speak of resilience. They simply did what they must, slowly, quietly, together, and each time destruction came, they built again. A home rebuilt stone by stone, a garden replanted, seed by seed, a song remembered, verse by verse, because life, even in the harshest times, still whispered in the embers, in the soil, in the silence, and the people, tired, bent, but never quite broken, listened. When the days were long and the work endless, or when illness crept in like frost beneath a door, people in the Middle Ages did not cry out to kings or healers first. They turned instead to the quiet spaces, to the chapel, to the cross, to the sky. For in a world where plagues burned, fire devoured, and hunger tightened its grip, there was one place they could still place their fear, in the hands of God. The village chapel was not grand. It stood low among the cottages, its walls built of rough stone and roofed in worn timber. A narrow bell hung in its arch, swaying with the wind more than the rope. Yet to those who entered, it was the most sacred space they knew, not because it was beautiful, but because it held stillness. The air inside was always cool, always scented faintly of wax and age. Wooden benches lined the room, smooth with yews. A small altar stood beneath a wooden crucifix, its carved figure bowed in eternal sorrow. Candles flickered along the sides, their flames dancing as if moved by breath no one could see. Here, voices dropped to whispers, not from fear, but reverence. The world outside was loud, crows cawing, wheels creaking, rain drumming on thatch. But inside the chapel, it was quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat, your own thoughts, and the voice of your prayers. Not all villagers could read, most could not. The prayers were not spoken from books, but from memory, passed down like recipes. They were murmured in Latin or the native tongue, shaped by hope more than form. Some were as short as a sigh, keep us safe. Others, longer, tracing the rosary bead by bead until hands grew warm and steady. Each day had its rhythm of worship. Morning brought a soft mass, attended by those who could rise early, shepherds, widows, and the quiet faithful. At midday, a single bell would chime, not as a summons, but as a reminder, a moment to pause, bow the head, and whisper a thank you or a plea. And in the evening, just before sleep, families lit candles in their own homes and recited familiar words, protection through the night, mercy come morning. On feast days, the chapel swelled, faces freshly washed, cloaks brushed, children fidgeting beneath their mothers' hands. The priest stood at the altar, voice rising and falling like a lullaby of sacred language. Incense coiled into the rafters. Hymns, slow, melodic, mournful, drifted out the open door and over the village like mist. Even those who doubted, even those with questions they dared not ask aloud, still came, because the chapel offered more than doctrine. It offered comfort. A place to kneel when the fields failed. A place to light a candle when a child burned with fever. A place to confess the silent anger, the guilt, the things too heavy to carry alone. Not all faith was formal. In quiet corners of cottages, tokens were kept, not idols, but items of faith. A carved cross from a grandfather's hand, a smooth stone believed to bring health, a dried sprig of rosemary hung by the door to keep spirits away. These objects weren't magic, they were memory, anchors in an uncertain world. Pilgrimage, too, offered a different kind of hope now and then. Someone, a widow, a crippled boy, a man who had lost a child, would set out on foot. No horse, no grand caravan, just a walking stick, a pouch of bread, and a whispered intention to visit a relic, a holy spring, the tomb of a saint. The journey was long, the roads unsure, but they walked with steady steps. Because walking, too, was a kind of prayer. At night, prayers were whispered in beds made of straw and wool, sometimes alone, sometimes in chorus. They asked not for riches or ease, but for rain when it was dry, for healing when fever came, for strength to carry on, for the soul of a loved one who had passed. The world of the Middle Ages was filled with hardship, but not without meaning. Every challenge, be it hunger, fire, plague, or death, fit within a larger tapestry the people did not pretend to understand, but still believed in. Suffering was not random. It was part of a story, a trial, a test, a way to become worthy of the eternal rest beyond this fleeting life. And when despair grew too heavy, the people did what they always did. They lit candles, they sang slow songs. They knelt, with heads bowed low, and folded their hands, not out of weakness, but trust. The priest, too, bore a quiet burden. He was not just a man of robes and sermons. He was the one called when babies were born and when elders passed. He blessed bread and buried the dead. He comforted mothers and heard the sins of those who had lost their way. His voice became the heartbeat of the village's soul, slow, steady, soft, and though not every prayer was answered, and not every illness healed, the act of praying itself gave peace. A moment of stillness in a world that was often anything but to sit in a chapel, to listen to the breath of others around you, to look at the pale flame of a single candle flickering against ancient stone. This was enough. It reminded them that they were not alone, that even in the darkest nights they were seen. They believed not in ease, but in endurance, not in loud miracles, but in quiet mercies, and so they prayed, not always for salvation, sometimes only for sleep, and sleep, on most nights, came gently. There were no graves with names etched in marble, no statues to the fallen. In the quiet villages of the Middle Ages, loss did not come with ceremony. It came with silence, deep and long and still, and it stayed like a shadow behind the door, or the creak in a floorboard once trodden by familiar feet. Grief was not shouted. It was not carried in black garments or loud weeping. It settled low in the chest, in the heaviness of a mother's hands as she kneaded bread, in the slowed pace of a man who now worked alone in the field once shared with his brother, in the empty place beside the hearth where a child once played with bits of twine and wood. When someone died, the village did not erupt in mourning. It exhaled, softly, and for a while all voices dropped lower, all movements slowed. There were no rehearsed words, no rehearsals at all, only the rhythm of life, missing a beat, learning haltingly to move again. The body was washed carefully and quietly, not rushed, not clinical. The task often fell to women, or the healer if she still had strength. Warm water, clean cloths, hands that had prepared dough and tended burns, now smoothing a brow for the final time. Eyes were closed, not with force, but with care. A rosary wrapped around the fingers, a sprig of lavender tucked beneath the chin, if it could be spared. The burial happened quickly, not for lack of love, but to honor the earth's rhythm. The ground was turned with simple tools, a shallow grave dug beneath the old elm oar in the field behind the chapel. A handful of villagers gathered, heads bowed. A prayer was said, or not. Sometimes, silence felt holier than words. There were no long eulogies, no processions, but there were memories, shared in murmurs. He laughed with his shoulders. She sang when she worked. He carved the ladle I still use. Simple, tender things, spoken over coals at night when the children slept. And then, life went on. Not in defiance of grief, but alongside it. The bread still needed baking. The goats still needed tending. The well still needed drawing. And so, people moved forward, not because they forgot, but because they remembered, and still chose to carry on. Children often sensed grief before they understood it. They noticed the hush, the way a father stared into the distance, or the way their mother held a shawl against her chest and said nothing. They didn't ask many questions. They simply sat a little closer, held hands more often. Sleep came slower, but dreams were gentler. Some found comfort in ritual, lighting a candle each week in the chapel, speaking the name of the lost aloud, into the wind before dawn, pressing a thumbprint into a clay token and burying it near the garden. These were not customs taught in books. They were born in quiet hearts and passed from sorrow to sorrow. Others healed through labor. The repetition of chopping wood, stitching cloth, grinding grain, each motion smoothing out the rough edges of pain. Each day a little easier than the one before. Until, one morning, the sun broke through the mist and warmed their back, and they found they could smile without guilt. There were those, too, who did not heal quickly, who walked the same path to the woods each evening, hoping to hear a familiar voice, who stopped short at the sound of a certain laugh, only to remember, who kept the same cup at the table untouched. Their grief was not a wound to be closed, but a mark to be honored, and the village understood. No one rushed their sorrow. Sometimes, in the heart of winter or on a rainy afternoon, someone would begin a story. Do you remember when old Beric caught the goose in his shirt, and laughter would ripple gently across the firelit room? Not loud, not sharp, just enough to warm the chest. That's how they returned, the ones they lost. Not as ghosts, but as remembered smiles, retold tales, fragments of joy tucked between moments of work. Music helped too. A soft tune on a reed pipe, a song hummed while mending a cloak, a melody that rose and fell with the wind, carrying something of the old, and the gone, weaving it into the now. The villagers didn't need grand orchestras. They had lullabies, work songs, and the low chant of the priest in the chapel, echoing across time and sorrow. Nature offered its own quiet mercy. The way snow blanketed a field made even grief seem still and sacred. The rustle of leaves in autumn reminded them that all things change and yet return. A lamb born in spring, a new sprout in the garden, a fresh loaf rising in the oven. Each small birth a whisper. Not all is lost, in time, new. Hands held old tools. New laughter echoed across the same floorboards. Children were born and given names once whispered in grief. Not to replace, but to remember. To let the names live on in curls of hair, in dimples, in the way a child tilted their head just so. Grief did not leave, but it softened, it became part of the rhythm, like the lull between planting and harvest, the stillness between prayers, the quiet after the bell. It reminded the people not just of death, but of life, of how fragile it was, how precious, and how, even through hardship, they had loved deeply. That alone was reason to continue, and so, beneath the shadow of castles and the open skies of the fields, people carried their scars, not hidden, not worn like banners, but woven into who they were, not with pride, not with shame, just with peace. By the time the first cracks began to form, the people scarcely noticed. The world they had known for centuries, of feudal oaths, of land-bound lives, of unquestioned hierarchies, did not shatter in a single moment. It simply loosened. Quietly, slowly, like mortar crumbling between stones after years of quiet rain. At first life seemed unchanged. The fields still needed tending. The church bells still tolled. The Lord still presided from his hall above. Yet beneath the surface, things were stirring subtle shifts, like the roots of trees gently pushing apart stone walls. The land, once the firm foundation of all power, had begun to move in different hands. The great lords, who ruled vast swaths of countryside, found their holdings shrinking. Some had sold parcels to pay for wars. Others lost land through marriage, disputes, or misfortune. A few, once mighty, now lived in halls too large for their dwindling household. Meanwhile, a different kind of figure emerged, the town merchant with hands uncalloused by soil, yet worn from ledgers and coin. The merchant lived outside the feudal order. He owed no knightly service, no allegiance beyond taxes and town charters. He did not grow food, he moved goods, wool, cloth, spices, salt. In the villages, such men were still a curiosity. In the growing towns, they were the heartbeat. Peasants, too, were changing. Generations had lived under the weight of obligation, tied to a lord's land, their labor paid in grain, hours, and sons. But slowly, as deaths from plague emptied, farms and labor grew scarce. Some villagers found they could move, and move they did, to other lands, to towns, to freedom. It was not rebellion, it was necessity. But in leaving their ancestral fields, they cracked the ancient pact between land and loyalty, and some lords, desperate for tenants, welcomed them. Oaths began to mean less. The great rituals of fealty, with their bent knees and clasped hands, still occurred, but their power dimmed. A knight might serve two lords. A vassal might withhold service. Questions were asked. Whispers passed among hearths. Do they still protect us? Do they still deserve our labor? In the castles, awareness dawned slowly. The lord looked out from his high window and saw fewer men in the fields. His steward reported lower yields. His hall was quieter. The old banners faded. The falcons, once trained for show and hunt, sat unused on their perches. Power had once meant land, and land meant people. But now, people moved, and power slipped. Meanwhile, in the villages, the church still held strong. But even there, change drifted like smoke. A new priest might preach a gentler sermon, less about punishment, more about grace. Travelers from abroad told of other lands where ideas bloomed, strange ideas, questioning the world as it had always. The villagers listened, though they rarely spoke of it. Young men who once dreamed only of a plough or a sword now imagined owning a shop, joining a guild, or sailing a river to a distant town. Daughters, once raised solely for marriage or nunnery, began helping in trade, spinning, brewing, stitching, not just for survival, but for coin. Coin, it glittered softly in the background. Unlike grain or labor, it was portable, impersonal, and powerful. And as markets grew, so did its influence. One could now buy land, freedom, even a title, things that once were passed only by birth or blood. The old order sighed, not in agony, but in fatigue. like a great stone wall bowing gently under time and wind. Of course, not everything changed. In many places, life remained as it had been. A man still kissed the soil each spring and whispered a prayer. A woman still lit candles for her mother and told the same stories to her children. But the echoes had started to shift. What had once rung clear now returned softer, less certain. A night rode through a village, and fewer children followed wide-eyed. A herald announced a war, and the men no longer rushed forward. A scribe delivered a tax notice, and the peasants looked not afraid, but tired. Loyalty, once firm as iron, had become soft as wool, and so the cracks spread slowly, widely, without noise, not a fall, but a fading. The medieval world did not end with battle cries or fiery collapse. It thinned like mist in morning light. Its certainties became questions. Its oaths became choices. Its once uncheckable structures began to sway gently, rhythmically, as if rocked by the deep breath of time itself. And the people, as always, continued on, stepping cautiously over the cracks, planting, praying, trading, dreaming, unaware, perhaps, that they stood not in the middle of the age, but near its end. Before the town, there was only the road, winding, rutted, carved not by design but by habit. It ran between forests and fields, across hills and shallow streams, and upon it slow carts creaked and boots thudded. A tinker, a shepherd, a merchant with a sack of salt. The road carried them all, and it carried whispers. News travelled with the wind softly, haltingly, of distant markets, of new laws, of ships docking in harbours far to the south, of scholars gathering to speak of stars, and of tradesmen who paid in coin instead of labour. The village folk listened, and though they stayed rooted to their land, some thoughts began to drift, like birds circling the fields, before flying beyond them. Towns were growing, not as grand palaces or marble cities, but as clusters of noise, of faces, of change. A few shops along a river, a market square beside a chapel, then walls, guild halls, schools, bells that rang not only for worship, but for trade and meetings. The town, unlike the castle or manor, pulsed with a different rhythm, one not of seasons, but of clocks and contracts. Merchants passed through more often now, their carts filled not only with goods, but with tales, of spices from lands where the sun burned hot, of books bound in soft leather, filled with letters that explained the skies, of places where lords were questioned and wealth came not from birth, but from trade at first. Such talk seemed distant, as fanciful as the old tales of giants or sea beasts. But slowly, the villagers saw change with their own eyes. The young men who once stood at the edge of fields now stood in the road, waiting for wagons to pass. The blacksmith's son asked about forging tools for shopkeepers, not knights. The miller's daughter stitched fine cloth and sent it to the town for sale. And when they returned, they brought back not just coin, but stories. They spoke of crowded squares, of guilds where bakers met and discussed flour and prices, of a chapel, choir that sang songs in languages never heard in the village. They described books chained to tables, written not by monks, but by men who called themselves philosophers. They carried with them different clothes, different smells, even different ways of thinking. The towns changed those who went to them, not because they rejected their village past, but because they saw a wider world, a world where one could learn to read, to reason, to question, a world of trade and craft, of thought and voice. And those thoughts returned home like pollen on the wind, Fathers sat longer at the hearth, listening to sons describe how men in cities debated the stars. Mothers asked more questions. Children looked not only to the chapel for answers, but to books, if they could find them. Even the priest, once unchallenged, now found himself speaking more carefully, not out of fear, but because he, too, had begun to wonder. The rise of towns did not erase the past, but it rewrote the margins. The space between tradition and possibility widened. People still worked the fields. They still prayed, still lit candles for the sick. But now, alongside the rhythms of the soil, another beat could be heard. The quiet hum of ideas. Trade brought more than goods. It brought parchment and ink, foreign words, maps drawn with strange precision. A merchant might carry barrels of salted fish and tucked in his sleeve a letter from a scholar. The cobbler might repair a pilgrim's boot and listen to tales of universities in Bologna or Paris. Even the cloth trader, returning from the coast, might speak of machines powered by water wheels, turning looms without hands. These whispers grew. They told of a world not just ruled, but understood. A world where man was not only subject to fate, but part of its shaping. Some resisted. The elders remembered simpler days, when a man's worth was in his harvest, when questions were few and prayers were enough. They feared the looseness that change brought, the fading of boundaries, the blurring of roles. And they were not wrong to worry, for the old order was, indeed, fraying. But others leaned in. They learned to count not only sacks of grain, but coin. They tracked the phases of the moon for planting and also for curiosity. They carved marks on wood, then learned to ink them on paper. They listened more closely, and then they began to speak. A new kind of voice was forming. It was not the voice of lords, nor of peasants. It was the voice of those in between, merchants, scribes, thinkers, travelers, people who moved not just through roads, but through ideas, people who questioned gently, who built bridges from thought to action. And through this slow murmur, something old began to thin the boundaries between land and mind. A farmer might still till his field, but his son, in time, might open a shop. His grandson, perhaps, might read Latin or learn numbers from a ledger. The past was not denied, only ... broadened. The world, once known only by foot and season, now stretched further by road, by letter, by thought. And yet, even as towns rose and whispers spread, the village did not disappear. It remained slower, softer, steady. Its chapel bell still rang, its hearths still glowed, its people still planted and waited for rain. But now, alongside those old songs, new harmonies formed. The Middle Ages had not ended, but something was beginning. The halls were quieter now. Once they echoed with the sound of boots on stone, of banners flapping in the wind, of hounds barking near the hearth, and feasts laid out across long tables. Now, the castle stood like a memory, grand but hollow. Its tapestries faded, its towers weathered. Its lord, once the unquestioned center of all within sight, stood at the edge of change. Feudal life, which for centuries had shaped every breath and boundary, no longer held as tight a grip, not because it was cast aside, but because it had slowly worn thin like the edge of a sword dulled over many winters. It had been a simple trade long ago, land in return for loyalty, protection in return for service. The lord offered safety and rule, the vassal pledged allegiance and might. Beneath them, the peasant labored, a life bound not by coin, but by oaths, by harvests, and by birthright. But power, like the wind, shifts when least expected. It began with war, not the noble wars of poetry and pageantry, but the long, grinding ones, between rival crowns, within fractured realms. Wars that dragged on for years, that bled both gold and goodwill. Lords, called to arms too often, returned home to find their lands neglected, their coffers hollow. They borrowed from merchants, they sold portions of their estates. They pledged loyalty anew, not always to a king, but to survival, knights. Once the pride of the realm found themselves less needed, the age of the mounted warrior, shining, armored, revered, gave way to new weapons, new tactics, longbows, crossbows, gunpowder, whispered of from the east, changed the rules. Armor that once turned blade and arrow now bent beneath the force of iron and fire. Warfare no longer honored chivalry. It favored those who adapted, who paid, who moved swiftly. The knight, trained from boyhood in the arts of war and code, now stood uncertain, his sword as much a symbol as a tool. And with that change, the code itself began to blur. Chivalry had once been the knight's compass. Loyalty, honor, defense of the weak, reverence for the church. But as battles grew bloodier, as lords fought lords, not for justice but gain, those ideals rang less true. A knight might be brave and still be brutal, might pray and still pillage. The villagers noticed, where once they knelt when a mounted lord passed, now they watched with quiet wariness. Respect turned to caution. Fealty became formality. The armor still gleamed, but the trust beneath it had dulled. Meanwhile, kings and monarchs, seeking to centralize power, began to draw authority upward. Castles once ruled independently. Now, royal officials collected taxes, enforced laws, and issued decrees. The king's justice replaced the lord's royal courts, outshone manorial halls. To many peasants, this mattered little. Their days were shaped more by weather than by policy. But gradually, they saw changes. A scribe from the capital arriving to assess grain stores. A new seal on a decree nailed to the chapel door. A royal soldier escorting the tax wagon. Small signs, but they added up. The lords felt it most of all. Their power, once local and lived, became ceremonial. They still held land, still hosted feasts, still heard disputes, but the authority they once wielded like a sword now felt more like a candle, flickering, beautiful, but easily snuffed. And so some adapted. They sent their sons not to battlefields, but to court, to serve the king, to learn law and diplomacy. They married into wealth, into merchant families, into foreign houses. Their power became quieter, more political. Less armor, more ink. Others resisted. They clung to old ways, held tight to titles, demanded tithes and oaths. They polished their armor, trained their men, clung to banners that no longer inspired the same awe. But the world moved on. Beneath them, the people changed too. Serfs, once bound to land like roots to soil, found paths to freedom through towns, through trade, through service. A boy might flee a manor and find work as an apprentice. A girl, once destined for the fields, might spin thread in a bustling city and send coin back home. The bond between lord and peasant weakened. The chain of duty forged over generations, now rusted, link by link. And yet the castles still stood. not as fortresses of fear or control, but as symbols of an age remembered, of stories told by firelight, tales of noble battles, of loyal knights, of lords who ruled with justice and strength. Old songs still spoke of chivalry. Children still played at knights and dragons. The banners still hung in the great hall. But they were quieter now, faded by time. Echoes more than declarations. Some mourned this passing, others welcomed it. Most simply carried on. They planted their fields, lit their hearths, whispered prayers to saints and stars. The world they knew was not ending in fire or fanfare. It was softening, fading, changing shape. And in that change, there was space for new stories, for new voices, for something not yet named. The crown still gleamed, but it sat now upon different brows, guided by different hands, answering to new rhythms. And far below, in quiet cottages and along winding roads, life went on, slower, older, softer, and the age waned. In the stillness just before morning, there is a sound so faint it almost goes unnoticed. A single bell, distant and soft, echoing across the hills. It is not the toll of alarm, nor the summons of a feast, but something gentler. A farewell, perhaps, or a beginning. The Middle Ages, after centuries of faith and famine, of stone towers and silent fields, did not end in war or fire. They ended in quiet transformation, a gentle dimming, like the last candle at night. People did not wake to find the old world gone. They simply woke to a different rhythm. The changes were small at first. A villager with a worn pair of shoes traded them in town and found, to his surprise, that the shoemaker spoke not just of boots, but of books. A farmer's son returned from the city and spoke of tall buildings, of maps drawn with careful hands, of men who no longer prayed before they studied the stars. A weaver's daughter stitched not just for her family, but for coin, and found herself reading, slowly, from a borrowed page. The past lingered in every corner, in the chapel's stones, in the castle's cold corridors, in the stories whispered to children at night. But it was growing quieter, like a once mighty river now threading its way into smaller streams. Old customs remained, but with softened edges. The feast days were still honored, but fewer knights rode in procession. The Lord still ruled, but now with advisors who read letters sealed from distant cities. The village priest still preached, but sometimes paused. Eyes narrowed thoughtfully at a question he had never heard before. And those questions were growing. Why must we suffer to learn? Why must knowledge belong only to monks? Why are some born lords, while others remain bowed? Not angry questions, not shouted, but wondered aloud in quiet places, in workshops, in halls, in gardens, and with questions came new ideas. They drifted in with the travelers. In books, once chained and sacred, now slowly copied and shared. In letters exchanged between distant friends. In the breath of merchants who spoke of painted ceilings and ancient statues rediscovered beneath layers of dust. Italy, France, Spain, the words learning and light were being spoken in ways not heard. For centuries, it was not a rejection of the past, not a breaking, but a reshaping. People still knelt in prayer, still honored the saints, still passed the same cottages and tilled the same soil. But now, alongside devotion, came curiosity. Alongside tradition came invention. The world was still rooted in faith, but now also reached toward reason. In this soft twilight of an age, memory was everywhere. Grandmothers still told tales of saints and miracles. Old men still recalled winters where wolves prowled near the fields. Songs sung in the village square still spoke of battles long past, of noble love and lost glory. Children listened with wide eyes, holding the old stories close, even as they learned new ones. And in that, something precious was preserved. The Middle Ages, though dimming, would not vanish. They lived on, not in power, but in presence. In the slow care with which a loaf was kneaded, in the reverence for earth and sky, in the habit of looking inward before outward, in the hush that still fell when a candle was lit, and a prayer whispered to the dark. Some say the Renaissance came like dawn, sudden, golden, loud with music and movement. But, for most, it came like the soft turning of a page. Not all embraced it. There were those who longed for the firm rules of the past, for the comfort of knowing one's place. They watched the changes with unease, the freedom of thought, the blur of roles, the hum of cities growing louder. They clung to what they knew, and in doing so, helped carry it forward. Others leaned into the light. They studied, they traded, they wandered farther from home. They wrote with new letters, drew new maps, painted faces not of saints, but of friends. They dreamed not just of heaven, but of what earth could become. But most, the vast, quiet many, simply lived. They rose before dawn. They fed their animals. They stitched. They sang. They prayed. They listened. They planted in spring and harvested in fall. They watched the world shift slowly, like stars across a patient sky, and adapted with the grace of those who had endured so much already. And as the final echoes of the old age faded, they were not lost. They became the ground upon which the new was built. In the city libraries and stone universities, the names of ancient monks and forgotten healers were remembered. In the marketplaces and guild halls, the memory of old contracts and crafts guided new trades. In the hearts of men and women who reached for something more, the echo of simpler faith, of quiet resilience, of enduring love remained. So the final chime was not an end, it was a soft note, long held, trailing off into silence. And from that silence came a new sound, the scrape of quill on parchment, the whir of a spinning wheel, the hush of a breath drawn before a new idea is spoken, the soft footsteps of children walking not behind ploughs but into schools. The Middle Ages bowed gracefully, and history turned, as it always does, slowly, gently, endlessly,